And welcome to Steel on Steel. We are a weekly program dedicated to the sharpening of ideas, news, commentary, interview, information, and debate, much of which you will not hear elsewhere. And our goal and pledge for over 12 years has been to put news and information out there that the mainline media are ignoring by ignorance, bias, or neglect. If you notice over the past couple of weeks, there's a lot of things happening. I don't know if you're checking everything online, but it tends to revolve around the area of A, the economy, B, the ongoing war on terrorism, C, issues related to church and state type of things. And a lot of it is tiddly-bit stuff. I mean, it's showing trends and directions, but nothing of overwhelming import. So what I've been doing in the last few shows has been to do material that lays much more background. Because if I'm right, everything is going to accelerate, lurch forward again, and accelerate once again as we get toward the end of summer. And having some perspective on a series of different things really helps, as all these little tiddly bits play right through you every night. And it allows you to organize your worldview as you see things go. All right, so what are we doing today here? Well, first of all, we're going to have a guest back on the program for the main part of this hour, Warren Smith. And he wrote a book, I would say over a decade ago. Last time I had him on was in May of 1993, as I recall. And he wrote a book called The Light That Was Dark. He was a major New Ager. Now, the New Age is making a resurgence after 9/11, and it is merging with this whole new consensus process we see on the political scene out there. So it's important, once again, we haven't talked about it in ages, I kid you not. It's important, once again, to come around and to say, let's see how far things have come and what the new paradigms being foisted on the peoples of the Western world are. Last week we had an interesting interview, I think it was last week, with John Loeffler. Things get a little crazy here on the show. Government by Deception, Psychopolitics in Southern Africa. His book was probably the best thing I have seen, aside from Chris Story's book. Chris was on a few weeks ago, examining what is being called the new transformational Marxism. The transformational Marxism is the new version. It really comes down to the Gramscian side of the tree. But the entire Western world is now embracing this form of Marxism. And it's pretty much everything like Leninist Marxism, except it doesn't quite have the gulags yet and the total control of media, at least as a realistic legal thing. It's maybe de facto. But they've embraced all of the other presuppositions of Marxism. And this is called transformational Marxism because it comes in a way that the populace gradually comes to accept these beliefs, thinking they are harmonious with the old beliefs they used to have about freedom and property rights and representative government, things of that nature. And so during the time of transition, it's very blurry, very hard for people to understand what is going on. I've always said this new globalism has a spiritual dimension to it as well. Remember back in 1980, Constance Cumby first blew the lid on this and took a lot of flack for it, talking about the New Age movement, which really wasn't new. It had started around the turn of the century, going all the way back to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, but was leapfrogged forward by Alice A. Bailey in her writings, which are the basis for many organizations, among them Lucis Trust, which today is a major non-governmental organization at the United Nations. Lucis Trust was originally founded as the Lucifer Publishing Company. I think a lot of the church looked at the New Age as this sort of quaint movement that might pose a danger to faith, but they never quite embraced the concept that this was going to be a new global or world religious paradigm that its adherents were going to try to foist upon the world. And so while it was in vogue in the 80s to talk about the New Age and into the early 90s, it sort of passed away out of memory, but not out of activity. And it's time we go and look at what this dimension is doing, even in connection with the war on terror. This is important. All of these things that I've said here on the program, I like to do it this way. All of life is interconnected, and all of these things that you are seeing are happening in a very interconnected way. See? Sounds like an Eastern guru, right? I had a gentleman on the program who was a former rabid New Ager. Last time I had him on the program was May 13th, 1993, Warren Smith, and he wrote a book called The Light That Was Dark. It was a sort of a chronologue of his journey through the New Age movement and then how he realized what it really represents, that it was darkness and not light. He has a new book out now called Reinventing Jesus Christ, the New Gospel. And this is very pertinent in the light of 9/11, since many of its preachers suddenly popped up on the national scene following the disaster of 9/11. But Warren joins me again. Warren, a long time. It's almost 10 years. Welcome back.
Hard to believe it.
What has happened so far?
Well, I think I think a lot of us that were out there in the, as you said, the early 90s warning about the New Age, I think we sort of got our message across, and then, like you said, it sort of became a little passé. A lot of us kind of drifted back into our day-to-day lives. There wasn't a lot of interest in the organized church or in publishing circles in continuing to talk about the New Age, although a lot of us knew that it was continuing to grow at an exponential rate. And recently, I felt very moved to write a book on the coming false Christ. And I just basically disengaged from my work, and my wife and I set up shop in New Orleans, and that was like on August 1st. And I started reading Neale Donald Walsch's Conversations with God books at a much more intense level. I just barely kind of looked at them before, and started to see a lot of patterns between what he was saying and what I had studied in A Course in Miracles and what Marianne Williamson and Oprah Winfrey have been presenting, Gary Zukav, this whole cadre of people that no longer call themselves anything to do with the New Age. They're now describing it as the new gospel. But, John, the thing that was most amazing was after September 11th, almost, just within days, there was Marianne Williamson being interviewed by Tom Brokaw on an NBC special report on September 11th and being referred to as a religious leader. And I just sat there. I was like amazed. I mean, I knew she'd gained a lot of ground over the last, decade. But I looked at my wife and I said, it's unbelievable. I said, Oprah's endorsement of Marianne Williamson, an unknown author back in 1992, the endorsement of her book about A Course in Miracles just catapulted that book to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and put the Christ of A Course in Miracles into the spotlight. It was like he came out of the closet on that show and with that book. And there's Marianne Williamson with Tom Brokaw. Then on Larry King Live, she showed up, and she was on a panel of guests that included 3 U.S. senators, a former Senate Majority Leader, a former ambassador to the United Nations, and a well-known political journalist. And she's saying that every problem, September 11th, comes bearing its own solution. And then in language that would only be recognized by those of us who studied the New Age and the Course in Miracles and the Foundation, Bailey and Blavatsky and all these people, she started uncorking a peace plan on these shows and encouraging everyone to gather together with their neighbors in little circles to pray for peace. And everything was founded on what they're calling the New Gospel principles. And the New Gospel is just, the same old New Age, same old stuff that's been going on. Man, they're saying, is divine. And when we don't realize that and experience it and teach it, we fall short of who we are as human beings, and humanity falls short of who it can be. So the bottom line is they're saying that humanity is on the edge of becoming evolved to the next level of our being, which is divinity, and that the only way we're going to get there is for everybody to join together and to accept these principles and to experience them. And those that don't, they refer to as fearful and separate people. And it's very sobering to see what's going on, because it's just like what you were saying. I mean, it's all enmeshed, and the spiritual part is now becoming political. It's amazing that this group of individuals, Gary Zukav, Marianne Williamson, Wayne Dyer, they have formed a group called the Global Renaissance Alliance, and they are going into politics. As a matter of fact, they describe themselves as a citizen-based network of spiritual activists whose mission is to make a stand in our local and national communities for the role of spiritual principle in solving the problems of the world. And of course, the unspecified spiritual principle is the new gospel notion that we are all one because we are all a part of God. So what it becomes is love and oneness and peace, the new gospel, versus fear, hatred, separation, that is being labeled onto those of us that would not agree that we're divine. And that would be not only Bible-believing Christians, but Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Muslims, and
right.
anyone else who doesn't go along with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you come up with the one thing that I picked up there is the opposite of love is fear, oneness versus hatred, but peace versus separation. Separation seems to be the key value, and it's ironic because previously, I mentioned to you off air, we interviewed Jan Lamprecht, and he's talking about the global consensus, how the dialectical process, everyone has to agree through this process of semantic deception. The same thing that Chris Story talked about, the new emerging principle in the Soviet Union. It's the same thing Dean Gocher is talking about happening here in the U.S. So it's a global phenomenon, especially in the English language countries, is that we must all proceed in consensus. The opposite of that would be separation. So that's the political side of the same coin. This just has a spiritual impetus. It's almost like the same gospel, one political, one spiritual.
It is. And Barbara Marx Hubbard, who's been around but has maintained somewhat of a backstage role in terms of the media, we need to remember that Williamson speaks for Christ. The Course in Miracles was delivered supposedly by quote-unquote Christ, but the Course in Miracles is the exact opposite of Scripture and the Jesus of Scripture. And so these aren't just people that we're talking about. Neale Donald Walsch is saying that God told him all these things. Marianne Williamson, is quoting Jesus. Barbara Marx Hubbard says that Christ talked to her. And all of these teachings that are coming from quote-unquote God and Christ are all saying the same thing. And what they're saying is that Christ is already here on earth. And in line with what you were just saying, Hubbard quoted Christ as saying basically that he cannot return until everyone is linked. I mean, it's a universal thing. It's all or none. Anybody that detracts from the process is going to be seen as pulling humanity down.
Right. Now, that's an important point because Barbara Marx Hubbard has a prescription for those who are separate.
Absolutely. It's pretty sobering. I did some interviews in the 90s on Barbara Marx Hubbard, and we talked about this Armageddon alternative, which is called the Planetary Pentecost. In a nutshell, it basically says that the book of Revelation is the description of one possible future, but it doesn't have to happen. If humanity links up, connects, all these buzzwords they've got out there right now, and imagines a peaceful future, one that does not have separation in it, one where everybody recognizes their divinity and their oneness with God, then this Armageddon alternative can happen, which is a peaceful world, everything being the way that, it was intended. And if it doesn't go that way, it's because there are those who are refusing to link up, those who are refusing to see themselves as one with God. And when you're not one with God, you're being separate from God. These are their terms. And so what she laid out is this thing called, actually she didn't lay out, the Christ that she's quoting laid it out.
Are we still talking about Course in Miracles?
No, this is actually the selection process of Hubbard.
Okay.
That she's laid out.
And where did she get this?
She got it from Christ. She's saying that Christ came to her in a very intense encounter in Santa Barbara at an Episcopalian monastery, and elaborated on a lot of things that she was given in a vision back in 1966, where she saw the world being surrounded by a ball of light, and there were massive healings and all sorts of things that were, God was reaching out to mankind, and it was a force that she described that literally rippled through mankind and just jolted people to the next evolutionary level. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of a counterfeit of the change that happens that's described when the real Christ really comes.
In case you tuned into the program a little late, I'm talking with Warren Smith right now, John Loeffler here on Steel on Steel. And we're talking about his new book, Reinventing Jesus Christ, the New Gospel. The New Age came on the scene about 1980. And it was a lot of talk about it in the 1980s, and then it sort of fizzled off into the distance. But since 9/11, the New Age gurus are on the move again, and we're talking about right now about some of the works of Barbara Marx Hubbard. I have an interesting question I want to ask you when we get back, Warren, but we'll do that. Our website, www.steelonsteel.com. We'll be back. I'm John Loeffler. This is Steel on Steel. Talking with Warren Smith right now. He originally wrote the book, The Light That Was Dark, He has a new book out now, Reinventing Jesus Christ, the New Gospel. And there is indeed a new gospel that we have suddenly heard emerge and break surface since 9/11. We're talking about Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is one of the leading figures in this. And a lot of this sounds a lot of warm, lovey-dovey stuff, but there's a dark side to this, Warren, because doesn't Barbara Marx Hubbard talk about cutting people off or purging people from the face of the planet?
Absolutely.
And what is she referring to that as?
Well, the selection process. Let me just give you some direct quotes from Hubbard's Christ that are in her book, The Revelation. These are all quotes coming from quote unquote Christ. This isn't Hubbard. This is Christ. Dearly beloved, I approach the crucifixion far more easily than I approach the selection. The crucifixion was done unto my body. The selection will be done unto yours. The second death is for those of you who cannot evolve by choice due to some deeply seated error in your understanding of the nature of reality. It is to open your mind that you will undergo the second death. Now, this is really important, these next two quotes. Christ, quote unquote, Christ says, the fundamental regression is self-centeredness or the illusion that you are separate from God. I make war on self-centeredness. It shall surely be overcome. The child must become the adult. Human must become divine. That is the law. And then he says, at the co-creative stage of evolution, one self-centered soul is like a lethal cancer cell in a body, deadly to itself and to the whole. The surgeon dare leave no cancer in the body when he closes up the wound after a delicate operation. We dare leave no self-centeredness on earth after the selection process. For when we complete the process of the transformation, all who live on will be empowered to be godlike. I'll do one more quote. This is pretty horrifying. Cynics, disbelievers, those who fear and cannot love, know that the mercy of God Almighty is with you now. The second death for you is a purification and erasing of the memory of fear through the shock of a fire. It will burn out the imprint upon your soul that is blocking you from seeing the glory which shall be revealed in you. So it's pretty sobering. And then when you read Neale Donald Walsch, his God is telling him, and I'll quote this one directly, his God says, but this paradigm shift will take great wisdom, great courage, and massive determination, for fear will strike at the heart of these concepts and call them false. Fear will eat at the core of these magnificent truths and make them appear hollow. Fear will distort, disdain, destroy, and so fear will be your greatest enemy.
Well, the theme's still coming through here. What is interesting is I'm not sure how much these people are all talking to each other, but they're all getting their revelations separately. In other words, the Course of Miracles. Who did the Course of Miracles anyway? That was Helen
Schuckman. She was a medical psychologist at Columbia University. She was seemingly isolated from anyone else. That's what gave it credibility to a lot of us that thought that Jesus was really talking to her. But John, I just want to say something really quickly here. These people do know each other. Barbara Marx Hubbard is on the board of the Global Renaissance Alliance, which was founded by Marianne Williamson and Neale Donald Walsch, and contains Deepak Chopra, James Redfield, Wayne Dyer, Gary Zukav. All these people are now openly aligning themselves as a single group, pushing this whole new gospel, and they're taking a real active stance. They're coming right at the church, and they're coming right at the American people, and there seems to be very little response from anywhere in the organized ranks of Christian leadership.
Or any of the other religions or even political groups, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to in the book of Jude, when he says, "Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that you should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints." It's unbelievable to me, John, that nobody's saying anything. I've heard almost nothing about anything that these guys are doing, and they're basically saying that they're going to run right over believers, and they're going to remove them from the face of the earth if they don't link up and become part of the new gospel.
But this is interesting that you should say that, and I'll tell you why. A lot of people are having a hard time understanding how this consensus process works, or why, for example, certain groups, usually on the left, because the left has bought into it much more than the right. The right is moving along quite nicely, though, however, right now, and will suddenly incur such wrath when they seem to be seemingly little issues. You know, I think you follow what I'm talking about. And the reason is everybody has to be in this new collective thing. Now, they would, in the New Age side, would call it non-separatist. In the dialectical process, we call it consensus. That's the common word being used. Now, that will change, by the way. You know that as well as I, that as soon as somebody catches on to what this means, we'll move the term. It will be changed
right,
to
like
another
from
term.
New Age to New Gospel.
That's it. New Age, New Gospel, the whole bit.
Yeah.
We went from New World Order to global governance, and now they're even talking about New World Order. And the only place where New World Order is ridiculed is if I try to tell somebody like a talk show host, there really is this agenda for this whole new system out there, I'll be ridiculed. But Gorbachev's talking about it. The Bushes have been talking. I mean, everybody's talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And of course, they're not defining what that is. That's the danger part. There's the semantic deception. But in the same vein, when we start, and this is why these things are important, these things all start as philosophical concepts, and they're usually adapted by religious people and by academia. From there, they move into the political arena, and from there, they become legal fact. And so this is not idle speculation, and you mentioned that there's very little reaction to this. And yet, at the same time, there was very little reaction when it rolled through in 1980, but it's taken horrible tolls already.
Yeah, I mean, you look at someone like Neale Donald Walsch, who founded the Global Renaissance Alliance with Marianne Williamson. They're really the two most prominent spokespeople for this new gospel right now. Actually, Walsh has taken a lead role even over Williamson right now. When you look at what God told Walsh, that's quoted in one of his Conversation with God books.
Right.
And I'm giving original material here because I think it's important that people hear what they're really saying. God tells Walsh, something will have to change. Something will have to be new if you wish your world to change. You must begin to see someone else's interests as your own. This will happen only when you reconstruct your global reality and govern yourselves accordingly. Walsh, are you talking about a one-world government? God, I am. So, I mean, here is God. This book of Walsh's was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 2 years. And many of the believers I talked to never even heard of Walsh or his Conversations with God books. I mean, it's just, there's a scripture in 2 Corinthians that basically says, lest Satan should get advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. But what's happened is that with a lack of strong leadership and without watchmen really on the wall warning people in places where they can really be heard, these guys are just running wild right now. And we just need to let people know what it is that they're really teaching and preaching. And sorry.
Well, the reason I'm saying is it's moving together. There's a double paradigm movement here. We have the philosophical movement through consensus, which has now been accepted through total quality management, say in businesses. It's been accepted into the churches in the name of church growth. It's driving everything in the West and destroying representative government. The left side is this philosophy that says we must be one at all costs and our differences must be harmonized or ignored, that type of thing. And so anybody will be tolerated in that circle as long as we have oneness at all cost. Anyone who is outside that, suddenly all the love and tolerance will disappear in a moment and will become incredibly vicious. That's what people need to understand.
Yeah, and that if somebody feels that humanity is being jeopardized by someone else's views, then their tolerance of that point of view will disappear. And right now, believers are being, in the language of the day, are being expressed or being portrayed as intolerant. The idea that we would say that Jesus is the only way is being viewed as intolerant. I think the best example that kind of sums a lot of what you're saying and what we're saying here is after September 11th, there were a number of books that came out. One of the most interesting ones was a book called From the Ashes, A Spiritual Response to September 11th. I was amazed to see that it was a mixture of some fairly big names in organized Christianity, interspersed with Starhawk the Witch, Neale Donald Walsch, all of them kind of glommed together, giving their take on September 11th. And what I found particularly interesting was T.D. Jakes did the very first article, and then just 10 or 11, 12 pages later, Neale Donald Walsch issues a challenge. On page 21 of From the Ashes, Walsch states, "We must change ourselves. We must change the beliefs upon which our behaviors are based. We must create a different reality, build a new society. We must do so with new spiritual truths. We must preach a new gospel. Its healing message summarized in 2 sentences, we are all one. Ours is not a better way, ours is merely another way." Then he says, "This 15-word message delivered from every lectern and pulpit, from every rostrum and platform, could change everything overnight. I challenge every priest, every minister, every rabbi, and religious cleric to preach this. I challenge every political party spokesperson and the head of every national government to declare it." What's unbelievable is that in this book where he's challenging ministers are articles by Jakes, Charles Colson, Max Lucado, Jerry Jenkins, Bruce Wilkinson, Bill Hybels, all interspersed with Course in Miracles advocates, the Dalai Lama, John Shelby Spong, Starhawk the Witch. And what I'm amazed at is that there's been no response from any of those people to the challenge to completely change their views and to accept this whole kind of one world approach and this whole idea that we have to accept the fact that man is divine. It's unbelievable.
You know, that's been one of the interesting dilemmas with this crowd that they faced as a result of 911. I almost said Y2K for some reason.
Yeah.
As a result of 911. And that has been that the 911 was a result of Islamic fundamentalism, what I would call it, okay? And it presented a double dilemma. The disaster of a firm belief system has been demonstrated, okay? In other words, those Muslims are following what they believe, period. But it's been impossible to attack that because the whole concept of oneness and separateness prohibits it. And yet that very separateness that they are exhibiting, and it is separation, let's face it, they are following tightly the tenets of Islam, would seem to stand in contradiction to that. And so there seems to be some confusion on the part of the sort of the establishment, the spiritual establishment, what to say about that.
Yeah, it all comes down to semantics, and right now all the definitions are being provided by the folks like, Williamson and Walsh and all the ones that are being purveyed in the media. And I think that if we could convey one real strong message in this interview, people really need to get to the bottom of what oneness means. What does Marianne Williamson mean when she says peace? Peace, according to the Course in Miracles, with its 999 references, means seeing yourself as Christ. I don't think a lot of people really understand that the Course in Miracles is so anti-Christ by the definition of the Bible. They turn everything upside down and say that anything that's contrary to them is actually anti-Christ. So it's all in semantics, it's all in labels, and there are some apparent contradictions, but they're running with these oneness, peace versus fear and separation, and they're making a lot of headway.
Which is, again, part of the semantic double talk that's out there, because they're warm, fuzzy words. When a Marxist, for example, uses the word peace, what he means is the cessation of any opposition to Marxism. And without that cessation, there will be no peace. That shows you. But when a capitalist hears that, when the people in the West hear it, they say, well, look, these people just want peace too.
Right.
But in reality, we have two different meanings for the word.
Well, that's a really good point. And when Marianne Williamson was interviewed by Oprah after September 11th, she said to Oprah and her, whatever 20 million audience or whatever it is, she said, what we need to do is we need to atone. And those of us that study the Course in Miracles know that the atonement in the Course in Miracles means at-one-ment. It means recognizing your oneness with God, your divinity. And actually, here's a direct quote from the Course in Miracles. The atonement is the final lesson that man need learn, for it teaches him that never having sinned, he has no need of salvation. So here's Marianne Williamson talking about atoning. It sounds kind of good, sounds kind of spiritual. And what she's really saying is that, there's no need for salvation. We save ourselves by recognizing ourselves as God.
Right.
And all these folks are saying the same thing, and it's totally contrary to the words that they seem to be using.
It's interesting here. This is a quote from that. I was reading in some of the quotes you had here from the Course in Miracles. Do not make the pathetic error of clinging to the old rugged cross. The only message of the crucifixion is that you can overcome the cross. Until then, you are free to crucify yourself as often as you choose. This is not the gospel I intended to offer you. Then later she says, the crucifixion did not establish the atonement. The resurrection did. Many sincere Christians have misunderstood this. She also says on page 209, for the undoing of the crucifixion of God's Son is the work of the redemption in which everyone has a part of equal value. The song of Easter is the glad refrain, the Son of God was never crucified. Now, so while we're using common terms, atonement, for example, or peace, they have totally different meanings for these two different groups.
Totally different. And,
right.
and they're not, it's really interesting because Neale Donald Walsch has a book that just came out, and it's all about honesty. Honest to God, and it talks about how people don't tell the truth anymore, and he's urging everyone to be really honest with each other. And the thing that's so amazing is that in his conversations with God, God says there are 1,000 ways to God, and they'll all get you there. Well, that he knows darn well that isn't true, because it's made real clear that if you do not accept oneness, you're going to be submitted to this selection process, and you're going to be removed from the face of the earth. But the way to get around that is that you're just being translated spiritually. I mean, you're ultimately going to get there. They're going to kill your body here on earth, and then you'll be translated spiritually to another dimension where you'll learn your lessons about oneness, and then you can come back and be a part of the oneness that is. So from their standpoint, they get around that and say, well, but you do eventually get there. You just happen to be killed on earth before that happens.
Let's talk about that. There was an interesting quote out of one of Walsch's books here that was sort of interesting about Adolf Hitler. And they were talking about this. In this case, God told him there were no such things as the 10 Commandments. So who said Jesus was perfect and Hitler went to heaven? And then there was a further comment about that.
Walsch, there's a book that he has out where he answers questions about his books, and he took a lot of heat, obviously, about the statements that God made about Hitler. We should probably get a couple of the statements that God made about Hitler out, just so people know what we're talking about. For instance, this is quote-unquote, Walsch's God. The mistakes Hitler made did no harm or damage to those whose deaths he caused. Those souls were released from their earthly bondage like butterflies emerging from a cocoon. That's in Conversations with God, Book 2. Another quote. So the first thing you have to understand, as I've already explained to you, is that Hitler didn't hurt anyone. In a sense, he didn't inflict suffering, he ended it. I tell you this, at the moment of your death, you will realize the greatest freedom, the greatest peace, the greatest joy, and the greatest love you have ever known. Shall we therefore punish Brer Fox for throwing Brer Rabbit into the briar patch?
So basically, Adolf Hitler did all of the 6 million Jews a favor by killing them. That's the translation of that.
I mean, that's the way I read it. I mean, that's certainly, Walsch goes to great lengths to say that God does not condone killing people. As a matter of fact, here's another typical kind of Walsch-God interplay where he says, for while you will understand that you cannot end another's life in any event, all life is eternal, you will not choose to terminate any particular incarnation nor change any life energy from one form to another without the most sacred justification. So, there's the out, without the most sacred justification, and if you're preventing humanity from evolving to the next level, which would be recognition of divinity, then you are seen as the weakest link. And the weakest link, as the program on TV so nicely, tells us, is not functional and needs to be gotten rid of.
Okay, now having said that, Warren, what I want to do is delve into this more in depth in the next hour. We're going to have clips from a speech given by Dr. Bella Dodd back in the 1960s, early 1960s. Let's see if we can sum this up, because basically I'm reading through what you're saying, going through some of the material here. There is no right or wrong. There's no 10 Commandments, no non-10 Commandments. All bums go to heaven. Remember the movie, All Dogs Go to Heaven? Yeah. That type of thing. We all make it sometime or another. But behind that, there is this sinister however. And the sinister however is, we must all be one at all cost. We may not dispute over rights and wrongs. We must preserve oneness, which on the political side is called consensus. We have to preserve consensus at all cost. We may not take moral stands. We may not take philosophical stands. We may not take theological stands. We must preserve oneness. If you don't, it's curtains for you. That seems to be the entire message of the whole crowd there.
Yeah, and Marianne Williamson, when she was on both Larry King and Oprah Winfrey, emphasized this point, and she gave some examples. She talked about how humanity is kind of like a tapestry, and it's woven with many threads, but it needs to be, as she said, a tight weave, not a loose weave. And she said a loose weave lets darkness in. She gave another example of how 1,000 people made it out of one of the Trade Center buildings by holding on to each other. And this idea that if one person doesn't perform their function, then they wreck it for everybody else. And I think ultimately, John, that's where this thing is heading. I think that ultimately, if you're not doing what will contribute to the evolution of humanity and to world peace, then you're a threat. And it's just like Hubbard's Christ said, you're a cancer cell and you need to be healed or you need to be done away with.
Yeah, but remember that the definition of peace, let's jump to that Marxist or socialist, the new global socialist, means the cessation of opposition to their philosophy about how life should be lived. It's a comprehensive philosophy. That's what everybody needs to understand, is that we're ultimately getting there. That does control all of life, and that there's a break point coming with the major religions, especially what we will call the monotheistic religions, save possibly for Jainism. I'm not sure they're going to be subject to this, since they were an offsprout of Hinduism, and but Islam and Judaism and Christianity, if they're true to the tenets of their own faith, will not be able to go along with this. It doesn't mean they don't love people. Okay, but you cannot go along with it. Here we are saying, at all expense, we must preserve the oneness, and therefore anything that challenges that oneness, whether it's theological, philosophical, legal, or whatever, must be disposed of.
Yeah, as you're talking, the thing that comes to mind is that movie Field of Dreams. If we build it, he will come. And I think that's really what we're looking at here, is that if humanity builds this oneness structure and then calls upon Christ to return, and of course it would not be the true Christ, it would be this false Christ that's warned about in the Bible, then the peace that would come would be the peace that this false Christ brings with him. So of course it would not be peace at all. However, in reading through remember Maitreya back in the early 80s?
Yeah, Benjamin Creme and the Maitreya.
Well, a lot of people just kind of snickered and thought that was passé. They don't realize there's a guy named Wayne Peterson out there right now who is speaking very actively about Maitreya, that he's here, he's ready to appear, he's going to bring great changes to the world, all sorts of reforms for poverty, hunger, just every aspect of human life. And this Wayne Peterson actually was drafted into government service through the Peace Corps by David Rockefeller at his University of Wisconsin, and he became a diplomat. He was involved with the Fulbright Scholarship Program, and he ended up being a career diplomat. And in his book, Extraordinary Times, Extraordinary Beings, he talks about Maitreya. He updates everybody on what Maitreya is doing and some of the people that are involved with Maitreya. And interestingly, I thought this was fascinating. He says that there's one political leader who does not mind being mentioned as supporting Maitreya in the effort to bring peace to the world, because this political leader is no longer in political power, and that man's name is Mikhail Gorbachev. And Nelson Mandela is also mentioned in a radio interview that he did on a Santa Barbara station that actually had Barbara Marx Hubbard on the board of directors. So that's really interesting that Barbara Marx Hubbard is on the board of directors of a radio station that sees fit to let Wayne Peterson get on the air and talk about Maitreya. So the question arises, is Maitreya the Christ that lays in wait to come forward when enough people gather together in prayer through Marianne Williamson's groups and the Global Renaissance groups? Will he emerge, and will Christians perhaps mistake him for the true Christ because they're only expecting Christ right now? All sorts of things that we should be talking about amongst each other, and not getting into strong opinions, but getting the information out, talking about it, looking at what's going on. Doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, and of course we're doing it here, but I mean, other than that, I'm finding a lot of the core issues of today are going ignored. I've always said my own position on the church is that it's very much like Peter on the morning of the resurrection. It arrives 5 minutes late, out of breath, wondering what's going on. So,
there's. I actually had a quote in my book, and I think believers were fond of giving that analogy of the frog that's being slowly boiled to death in the gradually increased boiling water. And as we tell that story, the same thing's happening to us in regards to this material that nobody's really aware of.
Yeah, but that is also the goal of what we call transformational Marxism. I'm doing some similes here, and that is there are 3 stages: traditional, transitional, and transformational. And there's a transitional stage, which is the most critical, because the people need to believe they're still in the old stage, the traditional one, when in reality they're in transition to this new transformation that even Barbara Marx Hubbard is talking about. See, they're all talking about it. The verbiage is there. You can hear it. It's like we were talking, they're all talking about global government. The United Nations calls it global governance as it tries to get a UN tax and a UN army, and now it has a global court. All the marks of a government. It has that. They're all talking about it. The only people who seem to be ridiculed are those of us who are pointing it out. I'm not quite sure why that is.
I know. Well, it's funny, John, because when my wife and I came out of the New Age, Constance Cumby's book, The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow,
right,
had just been out a little while, and we got a copy of the book, and I told my wife, I said, this lady, bless her, she just did her homework, she did her research, and she found out an awful lot about the New Age. And as a matter of fact, I think she revealed more than most people since. However, she kind of got a little bit confused and thought that some of us that were involved in the New Age were directly, knowingly involved with this other deeper agenda, which we weren't. And I think, like anyone else, she, stands corrected in some of those oversights that she made. But when we, as new believers, as we watched her being attacked by people, in the church, people, that were in positions of responsibility that were supposedly in watchman ministries, it was weird. It was like, wait a second, what are we doing? Beating up our own. The lady made a few mistakes, but I mean, her information is largely just incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
And then over the years, guess what? We experienced the same thing. It's like, unfortunately, there's a strong element in the church that has, it's just the false brethren, whatever you want to talk about. People that just think they're doing the right thing. They beat down the very information that's going to help them understand what's going on.
Because they don't believe that. One of the things Americans, Canadians have forgotten is a belief in organized evil and a belief in that there is more going on. See, they've adopted the line that all of our evils is due to poor personal choices. That, you see, there's a whole. I was listening to a tape done by Dr. Bella Dodd 40 years ago when she's speaking against communism, and she was a member of the Communist Party USA for a long time. But she said one of the things that drew her into Marxism was this lack of belief in sin, and
which is the prevailing thought in all of these teachings that are coming from false Christs and false gods through all these people. Yet sin is not real. Love is all there is. God is love, therefore we are all God, and the only real sin is to not believe that you're God.
And to be separate. And to be separate. Right. As Dave Hunt, we've got a roll here. As Dave Hunt once said, I have a problem with a God who forgets that he's God. Yeah. So you may not want this God running your universe. Yeah. So anyway, it also seems ludicrous, to be honest with you, Warren, because if you look at the issue, I mean, have you ever tried creating something out of nothing ex nihilo? Try it, I dare you. Challenge one of these gods to do it. Here, make a rock in front of me. Just a rock. It doesn't have to be anything complex. Just a rock. Yeah. Okay, try that. Anyway, where can people get the book? It is called Reinventing Jesus Christ, the new gospel that's emerging here. Warren Smith.
They can get it online.
This has been Steel on Steel with John Loeffler, an alternative information source for politics, religion, and global events. Program producer is Carol Loeffler. Engineering by James Clubb. The views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily those of the staff, management, owners, or advertisers of this radio station. Steel on Steel can be heard 24 hours a day on the internet at steelonsteel.com. A $5 or $20 per month subscription to Steel on Steel supports the ongoing program production. For more information, call toll-free 1-800-829-5646. That's 1-800-829-5646. This is IRN, the Information Radio Network.